The cart moves slowly through the empty street, wooden wheels grinding over cobblestone, piled with bodies wrapped in cloth. Nobody walks beside it. The doors on either side are shut. Somewhere in the distance, a bell keeps ringing, over and over, marking another death, then another, until the ringing just becomes part of the silence. This is the image most people carry in their heads when they think about how medieval Europe handled the Black Death. A doctor in a long black coat, wearing a mask with a curved bird-like beak, moving from house to house, offering nothing but incense, prayer, and the grim acceptance that most of these people were going to die anyway. No real strategy, no real defense, just superstition dressed up as medicine, waiting out a catastrophe with candles and hope. Here's the detail that changes everything about that image. That beaked mask, the single most reproduced symbol of medieval plague response, the costume, the Halloween decoration, the video game villain, the book cover silhouette, did not exist during the Black Death. And while that image many of us have burned into our heads is quietly historically wrong, something else was happening at the exact same time, in a small port city on the Adriatic coast that most people have never heard of, something that would go on to save more lives across the next 700 years than almost any other single medical innovation in human history. Here's the story we've all absorbed without questioning it. Medieval people facing the Black Death had no real tools to fight back. No science, no understanding of disease, just fear, prayer, and a doctor in a terrifying beaked mask wandering through corpse-filled streets, more theater than treatment. It's an image so deeply embedded in pop culture that it barely registers as historical claim anymore. It just feels like fact. And it's easy to see why this image took over. That plague doctor costume is everywhere. It's on Halloween costume racks every October. It shows up in video games, horror films, fantasy novels, banned merchandise. If you had to picture one single image representing the entire Middle Ages, there's a real chance that beaked mask is the first thing that comes to mind. But here's the actual question worth asking, the one buried underneath all that imagery. The Black Death, between 1347 and 1351, killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population of Europe. If the popular image is true, if medieval society really had nothing but superstition and prayer to work with, how did anyone survive at all? And more specifically, what did people actually do in real time while this was happening? Let's start with that mask, because tracing its actual origin completely rewrites the timeline in your head. The full costume, the long waxed coat, the gloves, the wide-brimmed hat, and that unmistakable beaked mask was designed by a French physician named Charles Delorme in the year 1619. Not during the Black Death, not even close. That's nearly 270 years after the initial outbreak that killed a third of Europe. The costume didn't actually become widely recognized and worn until later plague outbreaks, most famously during the devastating Roman plague of 1656. Everything you picture when you imagine a medieval plague doctor is, historically speaking, borrowed from a different century entirely, dressed up and quietly slid backward in time to fit our mental image of the Middle Ages. So, if that image is borrowed from the future, what was actually happening during the real event? This is where things get genuinely remarkable, because in 1377, while the plague was still recurring in waves across Europe, the small port city of Ragusa, known today as Dubrovnik, did something no government had ever formally done before. Its city council passed the first quarantine law in recorded history. Anyone arriving from a plague-affected region was required to isolate on a nearby island for 30 days before being allowed to enter the city. Later, that period was extended to 40 days, giving us the word we still use today, quarantine, drawn directly from the Italian word for 40. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't superstition. This was a formal piece of government legislation, written down, voted on, and enforced, specifically designed to stop a disease from spreading, centuries before anyone understood what bacteria even were. And this wasn't an isolated case either. Across Europe, cities responded with a surprisingly consistent set of practical measures. Town gates were closed to outsiders. Travelers coming from known plague regions were turned away entirely. The belongings of the dead were burned, on the theory that whatever was causing this sickness might be clinging to fabric and household items. Burials shifted outside city walls, moving the dead as far from the living as possible. None of these measures understood the actual biological cause, a bacterium spread largely through fleas and rodents. But nearly all of them, purely by coincidence, reduced the very kind of close contact that was actually driving transmission. There was also a starkly unequal survival strategy playing out beneath all of this, one shaped entirely by class. If you had money, land, or noble connections, your best option was simple: leave. Wealthy families and merchants fled densely packed cities for isolated countryside estates, putting as much physical distance as possible between themselves and infected populations. This is exactly the scenario captured in Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the years immediately following the outbreak, where a group of wealthy young Florentines retreat to a secluded villa outside the city, specifically to escape the plague raging through the streets they left behind. For the poor, crowded into dense urban housing with no rural estate to retreat to, and no means to simply stop working and leave, that option didn't exist. Survival odds were never evenly distributed. They were shaped, quite literally, by how far you could afford to run. Underneath nearly all of these responses sat one dominant medical theory: miasma, the belief that disease spread through foul, corrupted air itself. It was scientifically wrong in its mechanism, but it drove some genuinely useful behavior almost by accident. People burned aromatic herbs, carried vinegar-soaked cloths over their faces, and filled the air with smoke and strong-smelling substances, all in an attempt to purify the atmosphere around them. They had no idea they were dealing with fleas, rodents, and a bacterium. But the physical act of covering the face, avoiding close contact with corpses and infected surfaces, and keeping distance from crowded, foul-smelling areas of the city happened to reduce exposure anyway, for entirely the wrong reasons, arriving at partially the right behavior through completely mistaken science. Here's the twist worth sitting with. Surviving the Black Death wasn't simply a matter of luck, and it wasn't just a silent, invisible genetic lottery playing out in the background while people prayed and waited. Part of it was something far more deliberate, an actual, documented, written piece of public health strategy, invented specifically to fight this exact disease, using a tool we still rely on today, centuries later, whenever a new pandemic emerges. Quarantine wasn't a modern invention retroactively applied to the past. It was born directly out of this crisis, by people who had no microscope, no germ theory, and no understanding of bacteria, but who understood something crucial anyway. Distance and isolation seemed to slow the dying down. And then there's a second twist, one that reaches far beyond city ordinances and closed gates, all the way down into human DNA itself. In 2022, a study published in the journal Nature examined ancient DNA extracted from the teeth of people who died before, during, and after the Black Death. What the researchers found was striking. Individuals carrying a specific variant of a gene called ERAP2, a gene involved in how immune cells detect and respond to infection, appear to have had meaningfully better odds of surviving the plague. It's worth noting that other scientists have since pushed back on parts of this finding, questioning whether the statistical signal is as strong as the original study suggests, so the debate isn't fully settled. But if the core finding holds, it points to something extraordinary. The Black Death may have acted as one of the strongest single pulses of natural selection ever measured in the human species, reshaping the genetic makeup of European populations in the span of just a few generations, rather than over the usual sweep of tens of thousands of years. Let's look at what actually survives in the written record, because this isn't speculation, this is preserved, dated, government documentation. On July 27, 1377, the Major Council of Ragusa held a formal meeting to vote on a series of measures to deal with a plague threat arriving at their doorstep. 47 council members were present. 34 of them voted in favor of a new law, one that stated in plain terms that anyone coming from a plague-infested area would not be permitted to enter the city or its surrounding district unless they first spent a full month isolated, either on the rocky, uninhabited islet of Mercan just off the coast, or in the nearby town of Cavtat. This wasn't a suggestion whispered through the streets. This was a recorded vote by named officials in an official council meeting, creating binding law specifically to contain a disease nobody in that room could see, name, or scientifically explain. This kind of institutional response to epidemic threat wasn't limited to Dubrovnik either. English royal correspondence from this general period shows the same instinct at the highest levels of government. King Edward III personally intervened in matters of urban filth and public health, demanding that accumulated waste be cleared from city streets, driven by the belief, common at the time, that foul air and accumulated filth were directly connected to the spread of disease. Whether the specific mechanism they believed in was correct or not, the underlying behavior, government leadership actively directing sanitation efforts in response to disease fears, shows up again and again across medieval institutional records. And then there's the genetic evidence, which comes from a very different kind of archive entirely: human teeth. In 2022, researchers from the University of Chicago and McMaster University extracted ancient DNA from the remains of people who died in London before, during, and after the Black Death swept through the city. Comparing genetic material across these three time periods, they tracked how the frequency of a specific protective variant near the ERAP2 gene changed over time, and found it became noticeably more common in the population that survived into the years following the outbreak. It's worth being honest about where this stands scientifically. Other researchers have since challenged parts of this analysis, arguing that the statistical evidence for such a strong selection effect may not be as solid as the original paper claims. The debate over exactly how strong this genetic signal really is remains unresolved within the scientific community. But the underlying question the study raises, whether the Black Death left a measurable, biological fingerprint on the human immune system, in addition to everything happening on the surface, in law books and city ordinances, remains one of the most striking angles researchers are still actively investigating today. Think about the last time you heard the word quarantine. If you lived through 2020, you heard it constantly, on the news, in government announcements, in conversations with your own family, as the entire modern world tried to contain a completely different disease centuries later, using a strategy with the exact same name. That word didn't come from modern epidemiology. It came directly from that 1377 law in Ragusa, from the Italian word for 40, describing 40 days of isolation on a rocky island off the Adriatic coast. 650 years later, give or take, the core idea never actually changed. Separate the sick from the healthy. Wait, watch. Let the disease run out of new people to infect. Sit with the contrast here for a second. The popular image hands us a version of medieval society as helpless, superstitious, waiting passively for prayer or fate to decide who lived and who died. And yet, this is the same society that pioneered a specific, deliberate, government-enacted strategy for epidemic containment, one so effective and so fundamentally sound that the entire modern world reached for it again, almost automatically, the moment a new and completely unrelated pandemic emerged 7 centuries later. So, here's the picture worth actually keeping. Surviving the Black Death wasn't simply a matter of faith, panic, or blind chance. Part of it was the direct result of one of the first organized, deliberate public health responses in recorded history, written into law, voted on by name, enforced with real consequences. And underneath all of that, in a layer no one at the time could have possibly seen or understood, there may have been something else happening entirely. Human biology itself, quietly, invisibly, generation after generation, selecting for the people whose bodies could withstand what their minds never had the tools to explain.